Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
And welcome to the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Becky, and today I thought I would start by talking a little bit about the term virgin. So the term virgin, I think, holds a lot of weight, especially to younger people, teenagers, in high school and early college settings. But, you know, the term virgin, what does it really mean? I think you can say in its most basic form, the term virgin or the term virginity just means, you know, someone who hasn't had sex. But I think the connotation of the word has kind of, you know, spanned over time to mean several different things, and has been used in mostly kind of a negative context in today's society. I think if you go back maybe, 10 or so years, you can find plenty of, you know, media and material that categorizes the term virgin as almost a slur. Oh, you haven't had sex. Oh, that makes you a virgin. You know, oh, doesn't it suck to be a virgin? But here's the real understanding of the word virgin. Originally, I think the word virgin was meant to classify someone who hasn't had sex. And it still, you know, technically means that today, except now there's a connotation in our day and age that you have to have sex. And the main truth about it is that you don't have to have sex. And you should never feel pressured to have sex. That being said, if you are having sex, you know, great. Sex is fun. It's a way to relieve stress. It's a way to, you know, develop intimacy with a partner. It's, you know, generally just a fun way to achieve pleasure. But I don't think that as healthy sexual beings, we should be continuing this trend of saying to ourselves, oh, well, being a virgin is a bad thing. I think in this day and age, there's such a rush to have sex. I think there's a great emphasis on, you know, rushing into sex or getting it, you know, getting the first time over with. And if you feel that you are ready for that, then obviously, you know, take the proper precautions, you know, having conversations with your potential partner, and, you know, just doing it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you feel like you're in an environment of people who are saying to you, oh, well, you have to have sex or you're not going to be cool. Or, you know, oh, you're so lame, you're not having sex, you're not being sexually active. That's just crap, you know? I mean, who should dictate anybody as to when they should start having sex? There's really no rules other than, you know, the biological ones of, you know, are you able to have sex? Do you have a desire to have sex? And I think for a lot of, especially teenagers, there's a lot of hormones raging in your body, right? There's a need to start exploring those feelings and understanding what they are. And like I've said before, in my podcast on here, I think that, you know, sexual education in this country is just so terrible that, you know, I think we have a duty to our young people to make sure that they're making educated choices in terms of sex so that they are also having healthy sexual lifestyles. And with all that being said, I also just want to add to this, I'm not condoning, never having sex. I think sex is great. I think sex is healthy. I think it's scientifically proven to increase your health in life. Like I said before, it's a great way to relieve stress. So don't get me wrong. I think if you feel like you are ready to have sex, and you're being safe about it, then you go for it. I mean, there's nothing stopping you except for, yourself, one, or society for that matter. And what I'm saying here is don't let society dictate how and when you lose your virginity. And instead, have an honest conversation with yourself, or with someone that you trust, and decide for yourself, am I ready to start, this part of my life, this aspect of my life? So with all of that being said, the bottom line here is, don't stigmatize someone because they're a virgin, and don't stigmatize yourself if you are a virgin. Maybe you're just looking for that right person, or, maybe you're saving yourself for marriage, and that's fine too. But I would suggest not letting, today's day and age, today's society, to make you feel like you are in a box. For example, if you're a woman in today's society, and basically through all of feminine history, women have been kind of painted into these categories of virgin or whore. And granted, it is definitely lessened over the years, but there is still definitely a sense of, well, if you have sex, you're a whore. And maybe you're having a healthy sexual lifestyle, and granted, that's become definitely more embraced in today's culture. But then you have the opposite side of, oh, well, you're a virgin. And historically, this was supposed to be the better option, but it meant that women didn't understand their bodies. Women, haven't been encouraged until more recent history to really explore that aspect of themselves and to become more comfortable and confident with those elements. And on the flip side of that, men, for example, have kind of the opposite problem of, you're a virgin until a certain point, and then you have to have sex, or you're not a real man. And that's just not true either. I mean, men also shouldn't feel pressured to have sex until they feel that they are ready, they're sexually, competent, they know their own bodies, and they know what they want. And I think between all genders, we need to have a serious look in the mirror in terms of how we are teaching our youth about sex, and how we're teaching our youth to embrace sex, to learn about sex. And I just think we need to be better in that aspect. So let's take away the stigma when it comes to the term virgin or the term virginity. I think that if we collectively have that honest conversation with ourselves, then those terms don't mean anything anymore, or they don't have a negative connotation to them anymore. They just become terms that we use as a way of saying that someone hasn't had sex. Or maybe the crazy concept of just using the extra words to say, I haven't had sex. But that shouldn't label anybody as anything, or make them feel inferior to people who have had sex. On that note, I'm going to take a quick break. And when I come back, we're going to be asking ourselves the big question, are you emotionally ready for sex? Stay tuned.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hey, and welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Becky, again. And in our first segment, we talked a little bit about trying to remove the stigma around the terms virgin or virginity, and what that means to each person and what it should mean moving forward within our sexual society. And for this segment, I thought I would ask a big question, which is, are you emotionally ready for sex? And if you've already had sex, were you emotionally ready to start having sex? This was actually a really interesting question that someone had asked me recently when we were having a discussion about our beginnings in our sexual history. And the question kind of struck me because I don't think I was. I mean, just honestly speaking, I was a much different person, when I was a teenager. That's when I began my sexual life. And I think looking back on that person, I don't think that person was necessarily ready. And I could be wrong. I mean, you can't go back in time and figure it out, or I can't go back and ask my younger self, do you really think that you're ready? It's an interesting question to kind of ask yourself. And is an interesting question to pose to, younger people who are thinking about starting to have sex. And one of the things that struck me is, when do you know that you're ready? And no one can answer that for you. Maybe it's just, well, my body's raging and I know that I want it. And maybe that's enough. But for other people, it can be, deeper than that. It can be, do I have an emotional connection with this person? Do I know that this person is going to respect me? They have things that they need in order to feel comfortable enough to have the discussion of sex. But whichever way you're thinking in terms of emotionally ready, I think that the biggest question you have to ask yourself is, am I educated? Am I practicing safely with my potential partner? And what are the steps that I need to take in order to feel secure enough to be with this person intimately? When this question was first asked, it was in the context of when you first started having sex, were you emotionally ready? But I think this question can, kind of prevail until adulthood. And when you are well within, you've been with several people, you've been having sex for a long time, I think it's still something that you can ask yourself in terms of, new partners, or if you're contemplating one-night stands or one-offs or hookups. What are the parameters of feeling emotionally ready to do that, or emotionally eligible to do that? And no one can really answer this question for you. So I would recommend, again, taking a look at yourself, taking an inventory of yourself, and saying to yourself, what do I need to feel satisfied? What do I need in this relationship, in this hookup, that brings me to a place where, yes, I want to have sex with this person? Because I think this question can be so big, but also so small at the same time. I mean, maybe this question isn't as huge as the impact that it had on me when it was asked. But I thought it was something interesting that I would share on here and, start a discussion of, were you ready? Are you ready? What makes us ready? Is it just the simple fact of, having to do it, or having the desire to do it, and that's enough? Or is it something a little deeper that, maybe we hadn't thought of before in terms of starting your sexual life or in continuing your sexual life? And in having these conversations with my friends, some of the answers that I had found in terms of, when were you ready for sex in the past tense was, I had answers that ranged between, well, I felt comfortable at the time, there weren't any reasons not to I just wanted to get it over with. And I guess for me, looking back, and, knowing the kind of person, who I was at that point in time, I guess it's just hard for me to think that that girl was thinking as deeply about this as I probably do now, even though I'm much more comfortable with sex and with talking about sex, as you can see. I know for me, personally, I was in a committed relationship and we had been together for a while, and there was a lot of, kind of fooling around without having sex. And I think at the time, both of us just kind of thought that was the next natural progression. And again, with all those hormones raging in your body, being left alone, that, tends to be what happens. So looking back, it almost feels like it was a biological response rather than something that I had, actively thought about or decided that I was ready to actually do. And even going back to our earlier conversation about, virginity and being a virgin, I feel like these two ideas kind of go hand in hand of when are you ready, and not stigmatizing the idea of being a virgin or having not had sex with anyone. I think the decision to have sex is something that is both a very heavy decision, but doesn't need to be. Depending on your views of sex, depending on what kind of, understanding you have of sex, it could be something that is not a big deal and something that, you decide for yourself when it's time to, start your sexual life. However, I know for a lot of people, this is kind of a huge decision. And there's a lot of things that can go into it, including, your religious stance or, the way you were raised to perceive sex. And the bottom line is whatever you decide to do is okay. I am giving you permission that whatever you do is going to be okay as long as you're being smart with your body and you're with a partner who respects you, who understands that if you're in the middle of it and you want to stop, that they stop, and vice versa. But the one main thing to remember is whether you're ready or not is up to you. And even if you decide to have sex without necessarily understanding the answer or knowing the answer, don't let it be something that you regret. Because as long as you have, again, a partner who is willing to go through this, journey with you, this experience with you, who's respectful of you, you're both being safe, I would turn it into a positive experience. Anything can happen. It doesn't have to be everything that you planned. You just have to have fun. Definitely something that you can bring up at dinner parties. I'm just kidding. But maybe a nice fun party with your friends, especially if you have a group of friends who can, openly talk about their sex lives. It's something interesting, and I feel like everyone has a different answer in terms of, were you ready? Are you ready? So with that said, I'm going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking a little bit about sex in the media. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And welcome back to the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm, of course, your host, Becky. And in our first segment, we talked a little bit about dispelling the stigma around the term virginity. In our second segment, we talked a little bit about, are you ready for sex? Were you ready for sex emotionally? And what the connotations of that are, and bringing it up with your friends and having a discussion of what does it mean to be emotionally ready for sex. And in this segment, I thought I would go a little bit further into this kind of trend of, how we perceive sex by talking a little bit about sex in the media. So I think we can all agree that in 21st century media, sex is everywhere. I mean, there's that classic line of sex sells. Well, actually, this is an interesting story. A while back, I had actually found an article, which I will post on our online platforms. Sex actually does not sell. Sex as a marketing campaign actually is proven that it doesn't necessarily work. And I'll tell you why. The reason why is because when you use sex, and more specifically, sexy women, in, sexual innuendo-esque type situations, people are more likely to remember the girl than to remember the product. I mean, Carl's Jr. is a great example of this. A couple of years ago, they used Kate Upton in an ad where she's eating a cheeseburger in the backseat of a car. But the only thing we remember is Kate Upton looking, kind of like a pinup and like a sexual fantasy, but we don't really remember who the burger is from. And I think Carl's Jr. had this expectation that, if we put a pretty woman, a beautiful woman, with our burger, more people will remember that, hot women eat at Carl's Jr. No, we just remember that there's a hot woman on our screen. Even kind of looking away from advertising, most of our favorite shows have some kind of element of sex or some kind of storyline involving sex. And this can range from, young adult media, up, basically. Your soap operas revolve around sex and romance. Young adults media usually contains some kind of element of beginning sex or, starting a sexual relationship. And then all of the shows in between usually involve some kind of sexual fantasy or young couples being sexually active and intimate with each other. And I'm not saying that any of these things aren't great. But there's definitely something to be said about how it shapes our perception in terms of sex in general. And additionally, it paints this picture in our heads of what sex is supposed to be. And in a lot of, for rom-coms, for example, you have sex as portrayed as, soft and passionate and, everything goes right and nobody laughs and nobody talks. It's just moaning and they just know what you want. And that's usually not the case. I think we need to be real with ourselves in saying that sex can be funny. Sex can be unexpected. Sex can go wrong, Someone can fall off the bed. Someone can get a cramp. Real sex can be messy. And the fact that it's not portrayed that way in the media is, kind of does a disservice of, to people. And by that I mean it gives people this feeling that if sex with your partner isn't like sex on TV or sex in the movies, then you're doing it wrong, or something that you're doing isn't quite right, or you just haven't reached the advanced, perfect sex that they're having on screen. And for me, it's kind of sad to think that a lot of people feel this way. And a lot of people have this idea in their head of what sex is supposed to be, and then sometimes can get disappointed that it doesn't necessarily add up to their fantasies. Honestly, a great example of this is 50 Shades of Grey. I think when that movie came out, a lot of people thought, oh, BDSM, I can do that. That looks sexy and fun. But the movie on a whole doesn't really give the BDSM community a good look, does it? I mean, you have this man who is a dominant, but he's controlling and needs to have his hands on everything and anything. And you have a woman who is a submissive in the bedroom, but not necessarily in life. And when depicted in the movie, a lot of the things that they're doing, not that they're necessarily wrong, but a lot of the practices that they're using in terms of BDSM aren't quite up to code, you could say. Which is why when I had the opportunity to come on this podcast, one of the first things I talked about was BDSM and how to get into it properly. Because I think a lot of people have this idea with 50 Shades of Grey that, that's what the BDSM community is like. And it's not. I'm sorry, spoiler alert, but it's not. It can be fun. It's full of communication. It's full of people who are proud of their community, who want to give information. But again, the movie kind of perpetuates the stigma of, how we should perceive sex in any form. So what did we learn today, kids? Well, from section 1, we learned that virginity, or the term virgin, shouldn't be a negative word anymore. And in fact, maybe we should stop using it in that context. Then we learned a little bit about the big question. Were you emotionally ready for sex? Are you emotionally ready for sex? And I gave you a little bit of topics of conversation to try out with your friends. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about sex in media. What does sex make us think of? Basically, our overall theme is, how do we perceive sex, and how does our perception of sex shape our lives and how we decide to live our sexual life? And how do we take those things and internalize them? And when we do, is it in a good way? Is it in a bad way? No one can answer that question except for you. So I invite all listeners to take a look at our Facebook page at Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, and let's start a dialogue. What do these terms mean to us? Or if Facebook isn't your thing, you can also leave us a couple comments on, how do we perceive sex at our Twitter account, which is GSMC_sex. And I'd be happy to, discuss with you guys and, go into further detail about these things. That's all I have for you today, guys. As always, thank you for checking out the GSMC Sex Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Becky, and please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps us out a lot. Let us know how we're doing. Let me know how I'm doing. And I will see you all again next time. Bye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.